what's your view on addiction? What's driving so much addiction? And what can people do to try and break free?
Sure. I think it's a question worthy of a conversation. I think that we've been programmed, and it's not a good thing or a bad thing. It's just how we've been programmed. So I think behind every substance addiction or some addiction on some gaming or media or whatever, there's an emotion that the person is doing their best to regulate. So let's just say a person has been exposed to a trauma, right? And when we have an event in our life that changes our emotional state, the stronger the emotion we feel from the shock, the betrayal, the trauma, the news, whatever it is, the more altered we are inside of us, the more the brain freezes a frame and takes a snapshot, and that's called the long-term memory. And long-term memories, we remember them because we can remember the feeling associated with them. So what most people don't know is that trauma or those series of events alters our internal state, and every time we think about or remember the trauma, we produce the same chemistry in the brain and body as if the event was occurring. Now, the body is so objective that it doesn't know the difference between the real-life experience that's creating that emotion or the emotion that person is fabricating by thought alone. And it only takes a thought and a feeling, an image and emotion, a stimulus and response, and you're actually conditioning the body subconsciously into that emotional state. And that sets the baseline of that person's emotional state. So then the person goes, God, I feel empty, I feel anxious, I feel unworthy, I feel resentment, I feel frustrated, and I don't know how to change it. So then they look for things in their outer world to make that feeling go away. So whether it's a drug, whether it's gaming, whether it's pornography, whether it's complaining, doesn't matter what it is. But let's just use a pill as an example, or a drug, a recreational drug. The person takes a recreational drug. The moment they take the recreational drug, they notice a change in their emotional state. And the moment they notice that change in their emotional state, they associate that change with what caused it, and they remember what caused it. So that starts to create a dependency. Now, I think there are degrees of addiction. Some are very physiological, receptors are modified. But when you get right down to it, an addiction is when the body has been conditioned to be the mind. So then the person, every time they start feeling the emptiness, they feel the unworthiness, they feel the frustration, they feel the anxiety, their brain creates the image of what they need to do to make that feeling go away. And the last time, or the last series of times, it was that exogenous substance or that activity that made it go away. Now, here's the problem. Let's use gaming as an example, okay? So when you blow someone up, or you break through a certain level, or you shoot someone, or you get points for whatever you're doing in a game, there's a release of dopamine in the brain, and dopamine is the reward chemical. It's the pleasure chemical. The problem is that the amount of dopamine that's released in a very short interval of time is outside of normal. So now, rush dopamine into the brain, and the receptor sites on the outside of the cells say, this is way too much dopamine than I'm used to processing. So the receptor sites actually close down. They shut down. So now, in order for the person to get that same feeling, they got to play more. They got to do more. The stimulus has got to be greater. So over time, we start recalibrating those pleasure centers, those receptors, to a higher level. Now, what's the significance of that? In the absence of that stimulation, our pleasure centers have been hijacked to such a high level that we can't find pleasure in anything. You can't find pleasure from a sunset. You can't find pleasure from sitting down at the table and having a meal with your family, playing with a dog, going to see your grandparents. Especially for a lot of children, you can look at them and you can see that something happened to them where they're just glazed over. That's because they're kidnapped by the technology. And so in order for them to get that same rush, they have to play more, they have to do more. Now, here's really the big problem. Learning should be a reward in and of itself. Right? I mean, learning should be a reward. But now, for most people, they need a stimulus. They need something to drive their attention to whatever they're learning. And now attention is dependent on something outside of us. And when you capture people's attention, you capture their energy. And you can program them as a result of it. So the solution then is to teach people how to self-regulate. So we see people that come to our work that have had problems with addictions, all kinds of addictions. But really, it's some emotional addiction that really they're trying to change, right? And so they just been programmed to think that it has to happen outside of us. So what we discovered in our research is that you could actually turn that hypnosis, that conditioning around, and not wait for the experience to produce the emotion, but teach people how to self-regulate their emotional states and be able to trade resentment, frustration, anxiety for an elevated emotion. And if you keep practicing it, you get really good at what you practice. So good at it that you actually become it. So then when people start to self-regulate, we actually measure what happens to their physiology when they do it properly. And it becomes a habit. And so then when the person notices then that their body's out of balance, they have one of two choices. They can rely on some exogenous substance or something outside of them, or they can take a moment and recalibrate their emotional state. And the only challenge, I think, with addictions is that the moment you say, I'm not going to drink coffee, I'm not going to smoke cigarettes, I'm not going to drink alcohol, I'm not going to have sugar. The moment you make that conscious declaration with your conscious mind, the body has been conditioned and dependent on that substance. So 2 hours goes by and the body has modified its receptor sites and it starts talking to the brain. It starts saying, Rangan, why don't you start tomorrow? Tomorrow's a better day. Any other day but this day, this is not a good day for you. It's my parents' fault, it's my boss, it's the news. And that thought is being driven by the body-mind. Now, if we act on that thought, we make the same choice, we do the same thing, we create the same experience, we feel the same emotion, and then all of a sudden that emptiness or that emotional state goes away, and the person returns back to the known. So there is a biological, there is a neurological, there's a chemical, there's a hormonal genetic death of the old self because you're breaking that stimulus and response. That inhibition then causes the body to feel chaos. It's looking for the known, the familiar. So instead of white-knuckling it to the other side, we teach people how to regulate their internal emotional states. And over time, you start seeing the moment you're feeling an elevated emotion like gratitude or appreciation or kindness or care or in love with life, you don't need anything outside of you to make you feel better. You're actually doing it by yourself. And people can sustain these states like any habit for an extended period of time.
Yeah, there's a phrase I've heard you say before, Dr. Joe, that people often mistake love for pleasure. And when people start to feel whole again, they have less of a need for pleasure.
Yeah.
And I think that really speaks to what you've just said. You know, when you feel these, as you call them, elevated emotions, you have less of a need for these quick dopamine fixes, right?
Yes, exactly. I mean, think about it. I mean, how could you want, if you're whole, if you're whole, there's no need to want, there's no lack, there's no separation.
What does that mean, whole?
Well, here's how we describe it. We do a lot of studies on brain coherence and heart coherence. And let's talk about what it's not, okay? I mean, so when there's an emergency or when we're aroused by some threat or some condition in our life, or we can't predict an outcome, we can't control an outcome, we have the perception that something in our world could possibly get worse. We switch on that primitive nervous system, right? That fight or flight nervous system, and now the game is fight, run, or hide. The problem is with human beings, when we're at it, we feel like a loss of control. Our brain all of a sudden tries to control everything in our life. So every person, every object, everything, every place, every experience that you've ever had is mapped in your neocortex. So the arousal of the stress hormones drives the brain into a very high brainwave state called high beta. But then as you shift your attention from one meeting to another text, to another person, to another thing, to another place you have to go, every one of those different elements has a neurological network in the brain. So like a lightning storm in the clouds, the brain starts firing out of order. It starts firing incoherently. And when the brain is incoherent, we're incoherent. And so think about when you're stressed. The most common thing that people do is they over-focus. They narrow their focus on whatever it is that's driving them to pay attention to it.
Yeah.
And so then the act of paying attention to the problem is actually driving the brain further out of balance. And we've studied this. When you analyze that problem, that circumstance, that condition within the emotion that you are feeling and derived by the hormones of stress, you'll make your brain worse 100% of the time, because the analysis, the over-analysis, is driving it further into a higher thinking, higher beta brainwave state. So this kind of narrow focus is what causes the brain to be a house divided against itself. So we thought, well, why don't we do the opposite? Why, instead of narrowing our focus on the cause, something physical, something material, because the hormones of stress actually heighten the senses and cause us to become materialists. So matter is the issue when there's survival. It's whatever's around the corner. It's whatever's going to happen. So we said, okay, let's teach people something else. Let's teach them how to broaden their focus. And as they broaden their focus and take their attention off of everything material and everything known and focus on space, focus on nothing, the act of doing that actually starts slowing down the analytical mind. You can't analyze when you're sensing. And it starts to change the person's brainwaves into a slower brainwave pattern.
Right.
And so now as you start slowing your brainwaves from that high beta, you start slowing down, you're shifting gears, you go into a mid-range beta, then you go into a low-level beta, and then all of a sudden you get into alpha. Now alpha, when you're in alpha, the voice in your head, the critic in your mind goes away. That voice that's talking to you stops, and the brain tends to see in images, in pictures. That's the imaginary state, that's the creative state. And in alpha, when you're out of survival, you're looking for answers, you're creative, you're looking for new ways of doing things. So when they broaden their focus, not only do they move into alpha, but all of a sudden we start seeing those different compartments of the brain that were once subdivided, all of a sudden starting to unify. Different communities of neurons that were fragmented start to synchronize.
And that's what you call coherence.
Right, so what syncs in the brain links in the brain. So when you see the front of the brain talking to the back of the brain, the right side of the brain talking to the left side of the brain, you start knowing something good is starting to happen and the person's starting to create more order. So when you see those psychic union of two hemispheres coming together, you know, the polarity, that person starts to feel incredibly whole. And coherence, when you have waves that are coherent, when they build or interfere with each other, their waves get bigger. And the higher the amplitude of the wave, the higher the energy in the brain. All of a sudden, the person starts to become very relaxed and no longer stressed in a program and kind of alert and awake. At the same time, when you're resentful or frustrated or impatient and you're sitting in traffic, the same hormones are released and your heart is actually beating like there's a tiger behind you, but you can't run, you can't fight, you can't hide. And the traffic is frustrating you even more, you're releasing more of those chemicals, so the heart starts beating against the closed system. And when that happens, the heart starts beating out of order. Now, the heart's incoherent. So when incoherent waves interfere with each other, they're out of order, they diminish energy, and the brain energy leaves the heart. And this is when we stop trusting. This is not a time to communicate. This is not a time to learn. This is not a time to be creative. And energy leaves the heart. So we discovered then when a person truly starts practicing those elevated emotions, the heart gets very orderly, very coherent as well. And now, when you start feeling the emotions of the things that you want in your life or that you would like to create in your life, ahead of the actual experience, it's impossible for you to want it. Why could you possibly want it if you feel like it's already happened? Now, here's the cool part. Maintain that modified state of being. Get so good at doing it with your eyes closed. Start practicing with your eyes open. And if you can maintain that modified state of mind and body your entire day, coherent heart, soon as energy reaches the heart, we've done thousands of studies on this, it's going straight to the brain. The heart starts to inform the brain that it's safe to create. At the exact same time, the heart begins to produce an external magnetic field. You've got a Wi-Fi signal now. You start feeling connected. You start feeling more whole. The brain is coherent. It's directing a very clear vision of what it wants. Combine that clear intention with an elevated emotion, you have a different Wi-Fi signal. You have a different energy. And now the cool part about that is you start to see those synchronicities, those coincidences, those opportunities start showing up in your life, and you're not going anywhere to get them. They're actually coming to you. Now let's just look at the biology of this.
Yeah.
Epigenetics says it's the environment that signals the gene. Genes don't create disease. Our response to the environment actually creates disease. Well, the end product of an experience in the environment is called an emotion. So the person who lives by the same emotion every single day, the body's so objective, it's believing it's living in the same environment, doesn't know the difference. And they keep the same genes signaled in the same way. Genes make proteins. Proteins are responsible for the structure and function of your body. The expression of proteins is the expression of life. And the person now is in the same emotional state. They're expressing the same genes, and nothing changes in our life until we change.
Yeah.
Okay, so now the person who trades resentment and frustration and anger and everything else for an elevated emotion, and they can sustain that state, the body's so objective that it's believing it's living in a different environment.
Yeah.
So they're knocking on the genetic door. So the elevated emotion the person memorizes, the body is so objective it doesn't know the difference between the real life experience that's creating that emotion and the emotion that that person's regulating by thought alone. Keep knocking on the genetic door. You down-regulate the gene for disease and you up-regulate the gene for health because their body's in a different emotional state and the body's believing it's living in a different environment. And we've done studies with novice meditators, and we were curious to see what kind of biological changes would take place in 1 week if you went all in, like immersed yourself in the entire week-long event.
Like people do on their 1 week
Yeah,
retreats.
on our 1 week retreats. Yeah, so we draw blood and we look at about 2,882 metabolites, all exosomes, gene expression, and at the end of 7 days, the novice meditators, almost 100% of them, show substantial biological changes in their blood that suggests that they're living in a different environment. Now, here's the weird part about it. They're in a ballroom. There's nothing going on in a ballroom. I've been to thousands of ballrooms. There's nothing very exciting going on in a ballroom. They're actually making those changes inwardly. And I say to our research team, where are those chemicals coming from? Where are they coming from? The person's not taking any substance. It's coming from within us. And so the nervous system starts manufacturing a whole pharmacy of chemicals equal to the person's intention and emotional state. And it's how we think and how we feel that begins to alter things in our lives.
If you enjoyed that short clip, I think you are really going to enjoy the full conversation, which you can check out here.